As a result of his experiments, Mendel was able to draw up some hypotheses based on the results of his experiments. So let's see what they are. Hypothesis 1. There are alternative versions of genes that account for variations in inherited characters. Now, obviously, he didn't know what genes were, and he may have called genes as factors, but since we're already familiar with the modern word genes, I have put that in there. So basically, he was saying was that for if there's a characteristic and if there's alternative versions of a characteristics, for every characteristic, there are alternative versions that are inherited. So, for example, for the gene for flower color, do you think that's a character or trait? Well, it is a character. So, flower color is a character. So, his first hypothesis was that there are alternative versions of genes that account for variation in inherited characteristics. So he was saying if there is a white flower where there is a version of this character that is white, and there is a version of this character that is purple or violet if you want. I like purple. Okay, so he was saying that these are individual factors that are inherited. These factors that determine these different versions are inherited. And I've shown them here just so you can visualize what it means in terms of the chromosomes. Here's you have 2 chromosomes. These are homologous chromosomes. They both have the gene for flower color, but this one has the one for white flower color. This one has the version of the gene for purple flower color. Hypothesis 2. For each character, an organism inherits 2 alleles for a gene, one from each parent. So what does that mean? So if we have plant A, each adult plant receives 2 alleles from the same gene. So allele, what does an allele mean? Allele is a different version of a gene, as we will see shortly. So here's a plant A, and it's plant A. You have 2 copies of this gene. Why? Well, remember, sexually reproducing organisms are diploid. And just like we have all sexually reproducing organisms, we have 2 of each chromosome. So these are homologous chromosomes. And for each character, which we refer to as gene, each person carries 2 alleles for each gene. So it's another way of saying each individual, let's say, carries 2 of each chromosome. Now, there are different naming conventions for different types of combinations of alleles. So for plant A, you have this person has 2 copies of the gene, but one of them is purple and the other one is white. So this is the purple allele. That's the white allele for this gene. And we call this plant a heterozygous. Let me bring my pen. Heterozygous. Hetero means different. Zygous refers to zygote, which is the product of sexual reproduction. So this plant, which is a product of sexual reproduction between 2 plants, is heterozygous. It means the versions of the genes that it has are different. So these are alleles. Next, we have a different plant, let's say plant B, which has the same alleles for the gene. That's also possible. And we also can have a different plant that has the same allele for the same gene. In this case, both alleles are purple. In this case, both alleles are white. So plant B and plant C are said to be homozygous. Homo means same. That means the 2 alleles of the gene that this individual plant inherits are the same. Same thing with here. So both alleles are the same. In this case, the alleles are different. One chromosome, one homologous chromosome carries the purple allele. The other homologous chromosome carries the white allele. So let's repeat hypothesis 2 again. For each character, an organism inherits 2 alleles for a gene, one from each parent. Okay, so if let's say you have, blue eyes, you don't only have one blue eye gene, there's actually 2 of them. So you would be, let's say, homozygous. Hypothesis 3. If the 2 alleles of an inherited gene differ, which means this case, in a heterozygous, the one called dominant allele determines the organism's appearance. The other allele is called the recessive allele. Okay, so let's go back to our different plants. Plant A, plant B, and plant C. Now, if you look at this plant, you have an allele for purple and allele for white. What is the plant color going to be? In here, these 2 cases, it's easy to see because your only option is purple. In this case, your only option is white. So of course, this plant is going to have purple flowers. This plant is going to be white flowers. But what about this one? We have 2 different alleles. Now, what the hypothesis 3 says, if you have 2 different alleles, one dominates over the other. So this purple is dominating over the white. If the purple allele is present, it's going to dominate the situation and the plant is going to be purple. Now, what a plant looks like, the appearance of the plant is called the phenotype, which means appearance. So what would be the phenotype of plant A? Purple. What would be the phenotype of plant B? Purple. What would be the phenotype of plant C? White. Now, there's also a naming convention that you need to learn, which is kind of the standard naming convention for doing genetics in general. So we have an allele for purple flower and we have an allele for white flower. But how are we going to deal with following these different alleles through various generations? There is a naming convention. Each allele of a gene is designated by a single letter. Okay? So we use a single letter to designate each of these alleles. But the question is, what letter should we choose? The phenotype of the dominant allele is the basis for choosing a letter. In this case, we have determined that purple is dominant over white. So then what is the phenotype? Purple. Purple is the phenotype. So what is going to be the letter? That single letter is going to be the letter P. Okay? So if we use the letter P, how do we distinguish between purple and white alleles? The dominant allele is uppercase. So we're going to write it as big P. And the recessive allele is lowercase. Okay, so this allele was going to be designated with capital P, and this allele is going to be designated as lowercase p. Okay, so now let's take a look at phenotype and genotype. We have plant A, B, and C. Genotype, the name genotype refers to the genetic makeup of an individual. So let's take a look at the genotypes. This plant is heterozygous, meaning that it has 2 different alleles, right? The purple and the white. So how do we write the genetic makeup? Well, we use the naming convention that we just determined. Remember, we said for the P, let me write it here. For the purple allele, we have big P. And for the white allele, we have little p. Oops, little p. Okay? So therefore, the genotype of this plant is big P, little p. What about the phenotype of this plant? Well, we said the big P, the purple, is dominant over white. So then the phenotype is going to be purple. Now, what about plant B? It's big P because we have two big P's in here. One in here and one in here. So the phenotype obviously is going to be purple because that's the only option we have. What about plant C? It's going to be little p, right? Because that's all we have. And that's the symbol that we use for a recessive allele, not for the dominant allele. And the appearance is going to be white because that's the only option we have. So next, we're going to talk about Mendel's law of segregation.